extension 720 with Milt Rosenberg on 720 WGN.
My guest, as I told you a moment ago, is a distinguished American-Israeli journalist, Carolyn Glick, who, one might instantly specify, was raised in Chicago, in fact, in Hyde Park, but some 20 years ago moved to Israel after getting one college degree here in the country, and she came back after a while to get yet another at Harvard, and is one of the leading political commentators in Israel. I say commentators because she is often to be seen and heard on Israeli television, but basically she is a newspaper journalist, the newspaper being the Jerusalem Post, for which she is officially listed as deputy managing editor. What does that really mean for you?
It means that I have a very nice title, but right now the only thing I've been editing for several years has been my own columns that I write twice a week. So, and
as I look at the Jerusalem Post, and I do look at it regularly, there is no columnist who gets more reader response than you do.
No, I'm glad to see that my columns always attract a lot of attention, and they tend to be republished in many leading websites here in the United States as well as throughout the world. So it's a very gratifying experience as a writer to see that so many people are interested in what I have to say.
Well, you're dealing with the basic issues of life or death for the state of Israel, essentially. And let me get directly into that realm of concern and discourse. A little bit of a workup towards it. After the release of more than 1,000 terrorists, they haven't all been released yet, but 500 or more have been, and the rest are scheduled, and they're being released in exchange of one captured Israeli soldier, Gideon Shalit. After new signs that the PLO will again unite, that Fatah and Hamas are getting together to form yet another, quote, government. After Mahmoud Abbas, the present designated president of the PLO, has reiterated his and the PLO's eternal opposition to a Jewish state, to a state identified as for Jews. After the renewal of missile assaults from Gaza and from terrorist territories, and after, for that matter, a kind of a grim standoff between the President of the United States and the President of Israel. What is the temper of Israeli public opinion? Public opinion about their own future, about the initiatives that they should be taking, or for that matter, the responses they should be making. It's a long, big setup, but that gives you an opportunity now to just tell me, what do you read? What do you see?
Well, Israeli public opinion is interesting because it seems on its face to be self-contradictory. The majority of Israelis believe that there is no prospect for peace with the Palestinians in the coming generation, and that the peace process, such as it is, that was supposed to lead to the establishment of a Palestinian state that would be living at peace with Israel, has completely and utterly failed. That the Palestinians themselves are not interested in coexistence with Israel. And on the other side, the vast majority of Israelis are very hopeful about the future, optimistic and happy with their lives in Israel, and looking forward to the future with great optimism. And I think the reasons for both of these positions that seem on the face of it to be contradictory are actually quite reasonable. As you mentioned in your long setup, the Palestinians really have proven time and again, to the point where it's simply undeniable to anybody who has his eyes in his head, that they don't want peace with Israel, and there's no possibility of ever making peace with them unless something fundamentally changes with them. That is, there's nothing that Israel itself can do to convince them. They have to transform themselves. They have to change themselves, and that's not something that any Israeli government can be accountable for. And on the other hand, at a time when the world economy is really in a state of slowdown and near a double-dip recession, the Israeli economy is growing at a rapid clip of over 5% a year in GDP. We just discovered massive oil deposits and oil sands south of Jerusalem that have an estimated market value of $30 trillion. That's twice the U.S. national deficit. We've discovered large deposits of natural gas, also in the sea, in Israel's territorial waters that are about to begin to be developed. And Israel's economy without those new energy resources that have been discovered in recent years was already growing very quickly thanks to its leading role in world high-tech markets and biotechnological innovation.
And Israel has become a great capitalist state. Mm-hmm. George Gilder, in his book of a few years ago, makes very clear that they are a flourishing capitalist state since they put socialism aside, mm-hmm. and they provide a kind of an example for all the rest of the world. But since Gilder favors Israeli capitalism, you favor it, and I favor it, whether in Israel or in the United States, you won't be surprised that we're about to pause for some commercials. Okay. But before we do, let me pose this basic question. You've asserted that the Palestinians, it's now clear, you say, have no desire for, no interest in peace with Israel. That's a very strong judgment. I want to know the basis for it. And we'll come directly to the question of what are the Palestinians really after, as we return to Carolyn Glick directly after these words.
Extension 720 with Milt Rosenberg on 720 WGN.
And we return to Carolyn Glick of the Jerusalem Post. And I just quickly reinstate that basic question. What, as you see it, do the Palestinians really want? And how do we know?
Well, we know what the Palestinians want because they tell us all the time. What they want is the extinction of the Jewish state. And, you know, it's important to recognize this, that in 2000, Israel offered the Palestinian statehood in exchange for peace on almost the entire West Bank of the Jordan River and all of Gaza, including, also involved a partition of Jerusalem and transfer.
That was during the premiership of
Ehud
Barak. Who is now the
defense minister
of the State of Israel.
Right, and Yasser Arafat, not only did he reject the offer, but he didn't make any counteroffers. Instead, he came back to the territories and he ordered his troops to prepare for war, which he launched against Israel on September 28, 2000. And at that time, Fatah and the PA security services and Islamic Jihad were all openly collaborating in terrorist attacks against Israel. 70% of Israeli casualties were civilians because they were the main target in this terror war. Then in 2008, Ehud Olmert offered Arafat's successor, Mahmoud Abbas, an even sweeter deal where he gave them even more. Barak had offered Arafat 92 and then 95% of the West Bank, and Olmert offered them essentially 98% of the West Bank, plus land swaps of territory inside of sovereign Israel in exchange for the 2% Israel would retain, all of the Arab neighborhoods in Jerusalem, and of course the entire Gaza Strip, which Israel already surrendered lock, stock, and barrel in 2005. And again, Abbas said no and didn't make a counteroffer.
But wait. He said no, but he must have given some reasons. Was it the Jerusalem matter or the return of so-called Palestinian refugees? What reasons did they give for rejecting the deal?
So one of the main reasons that Abbas has given is that Olmert, although he made concessions in terms of allowing a symbolic number of so-called Palestinian refugees, which aren't actually refugees at all,
they're just third-generation refugees.
Third and fourth-generation foreign-born Arabs who haven't been granted citizenship in other Arab countries where they and their families have lived for 4 generations. But he gave them a symbolic gesture in terms of several thousand who would be allowed to come to Israel as citizens. And that isn't sufficient for Abbas and for the Palestinians. They insist on Israel committing national suicide in exchange for so-called peace by saying that in exchange for peace from them, Israel is going to have to not only shrink itself to within what are, by all accounts, indefensible borders, but that it also has to accept 5 million foreign-born hostile Arabs as full citizens within that truncated territory, meaning that it has to drive itself into extinction. So these are the demands that are made, and they're so unreasonable and so clearly ridiculous from the perspective of any state that wishes to continue to exist, that the only way that you can interpret it is by saying, okay, the Palestinians are fundamentally unserious. They don't want a Palestinian state. They had the opportunity not only in 2000 and 2008, but before that in 1939 and 1936 and 1947, and at each time they rejected it and went to war against Israel. So what they really are after is not the establishment of a Palestinian state, but the destruction of the Jewish state.
What did those offers do about the West Bank, quote, settlements? Because that also is one of the big complaints that you get from the PLO, is it not?
It is, but you have to also recognize that the PLO was formed in 1964. Fatah was formed in 1955. That was well before this 1967 Six-Day War, as a consequence of which Israel took control over these territories and built Jewish communities.
A war initiated, of course, by
the Arabs.
By the Arabs.
And so, you look at this and you say, well, if the settlements are the cause of the conflict, then why did the conflict itself predate the establishment of settlements by several decades? Why did the PLO get formed as the supposed liberation organization to liberate Palestine when the Palestine they claimed that they want was under Arab control at the time? So, none of this makes sense. All of it is counter-historical and counterfactual. And yet, in all of these cases, by the way, in the Barak's offer in 2000 and Olmert's offer in 2008, they were certainly stipulating that some, at minimum 100,000 Israelis would be expelled from their homes and their communities that they built. Some of them on an ancestral Jewish land would be transferred lock, stock, and barrel to the Palestinians.
That ancestral, when you speak of ancestral Jewish land, what you're doing is referring to what is called Judea and Samaria, right. Yedova and Shamron. But they would argue that it may have been ancestral land, but it was not occupied by Jews until essentially Begin started that let's create facts upon the ground policy of establishing those settlements.
No, it was actually the Labor government. It wasn't Begin. It was Golda Meir.
Goes back that far.
Yeah, when she became premier in 1969. So, and Levi Eshkol, who was the prime minister in 1967, called for, annexed essentially Jerusalem. So this is not true again. But, the Palestinians, one of the most insidious things that they and their supporters and the left have been doing is trying to erase the history of the Jewish people from the land of Israel. They've done it, most graphically at the Temple Mount, where they have undertaken illegal excavations to destroy the remnants of the Second Temple from underneath the mosques that they built there many centuries later. And but they've also done it in Judea and Samaria, which the geographical description of which is the West Bank of the Jordan River, and has become popular parlance internationally, although in Israel the areas are referred to as Judea and Samaria. But they turned Joseph's tomb into a mosque after a mob of Palestinians overran the holy site in 2000.
Hebron.
In Hebron, they've denied the heritage of the Jewish city, even though Hebron is the site of the first recorded property deal in human history when Abraham bought the burial plot of Machpelah for his wife Sarah after she died. And Sarah and Abraham and Rebekah and Isaac and Jacob are all buried at the site, and Leah. So, this is clearly a Jewish burial site. It is recorded. The purchase of the area of the tomb for the purpose of burying Sarah is recorded, and yet they deny all of this Jewish history in order to try to create an imagined legacy of a Palestinian people that in effect only came into existence in 1967.